Hi everyone, and good evening or morning and afternoon if you're in a different part of the world. Thank you for taking your time to join our live webinar today. My name is Grace and I overlook all of the exciting things that happen at BenQ, including our live webinars. I will be your co-host in this live webinar with our main star, Ian. Now, Ian is a multi-award winning commercial photographer, actually based in Melbourne, Australia. He specializes in advertising, aerial, fashion, food, corporate people, public relations, and portraiture, product and industrial photography, who first opened his studio, Altered Images Photography, back in 1986. He is also an accredited professional photographer, life member, Master of Photography for Honorary Fellow and Fellow of the Australian Institute of Professional Photography, also known as AIPP. Ian has, in recent decades, accumulated numerous industry awards and titles. Ian has been awarded the AIPP Victorian Landscape Photographer of the Year title, not once, but twice, in both 2012 and 2017. He also took out the AIPP Victorian Illustrative Photographer of the Year in 2012, giving him 2 category wins that year. Now, going through some of the topics in our webinar today, Ian will share his photographic journey, knowledge and experience on best practices for shooting, color management and color accuracy, hardware versus software calibration, and there's also a chance for you to ask him any questions you may have at the end. Ian has also received a large amount of topics in advance from some attendees, and he will try to cover as much as he can here. Feel free to ask any questions throughout the webinar, but we'll get back to you at the end of the session in case we go off topic. So there will also be a quick survey once the webinar finishes. If you could please provide some feedback, that would be greatly appreciated and would also help us for the future webinars. We'll also include some links in the chat if you want to check out more of Ian's work and the monitor he's been using. Now over to Ian.
Okay, I'm able to share.
Yeah.
Now, okay. All right. Okay, well, welcome everybody and thanks for signing in. Thank you for the introduction, Grace. You've basically just ruined my first slide. you've covered everything I was going to cover, but I'll just go through fairly quickly. Before I start, I'll say we've got a heap of stuff to get through tonight, and we're probably only going to scratch the surface in an hour. So I'm going to touch on things. If there's any specific questions that are pertinent to issues you're having, just make note of them and hand them over to me at the end, and I'll try and answer them as best I can. But yeah, we'll go through and see how we go. So basically, I've been a commercial photographer in Melbourne for 35 plus years. I graduated from Photography Studies College here in Melbourne in '84. I opened my studio, not in this premises that I am now, but a couple of premises ago in 1986. I was the state president of the AIPP from 1998 to 1999, national president from 2002 to 2004. I'm currently a brand ambassador for BenQ Ilford Pro Photo lighting and X-Rite colour management equipment, and just the other bits and pieces that Grace has already filled you in on. So I'm just going to go through a little bit of work first and foremost, so that you can get into my head a little bit, work out what it is that I do. So I suppose my photography would be split into two areas: my commercial work, the work that I do that I get paid for, and the work that I do to keep me interested. I'll just slowly click through the images and give you a bit of background. So I opened my studio, as I said, in 1986 after convincing my parents to go guarantor on a loan. And I stupidly thought that if I hung a sign on my door that said commercial photographer, that I'd have people queuing at the door to give me money and get me to do work. But unfortunately, that doesn't happen in the real world. And very, very quickly, I realised that I had to diversify. So I have shot weddings over the years. I've probably shot about 500 weddings in my career. I've run a school photography business. I've also done numerous portraits, but about 20 years ago, I made the decision to basically stop doing everything and focus on commercial photography. Now, a couple of things brought me to that decision. One of them was the digital age. It sort of reinvigorated me. About 15 years in, I was actually quite burnt out because I never imagined myself as a wedding photographer, and I never imagined myself as a school photographer. It's not really why I got into photography. But digital sort of encouraged me to go out shooting again. So I started shooting for myself, and basically that reignited my passion reignited my passion for photography. And I'd have to say that as a result of all of that, I'm pretty much more passionate now than I've ever been. Looking through the work that I'm showing you, you'll see that I photograph everything from machinery like tractors and excavators. I do aerial photography. I photograph people. I photograph packaging, products, food, for all sorts of things, for websites, for packaging, for posters, for promotion, for whatever a client may need photography for. But commercial photography is basically the distinction between photographing for a business to business photography, as opposed to domestic photography where we're photographing for a consumer, like weddings, portraits, pets and so forth. So for the last 20 years, I've focused only on business to business photography. I really enjoy what I do, but the images that I'm showing you, I've had great fun taking and I enjoy my job, but it's not what I would choose to do for me. That's where my personal photography comes in. So what we're looking at here now is my personal photography. So this came about probably in a number of stages. I started shooting for myself about 20 years ago, which I'd stopped pretty much since I finished college. And I felt that, just my commercial work should keep me happy, but I found it didn't. I found that shooting for other people and doing what other people wanted me to do didn't really satisfy me commercially. So I started shooting for myself again. And through a little bit of a way, I stumbled on long exposure photography. And that came about basically because at the end of the day, there wasn't really a lot of time to go out and shoot in daylight. And I was pretty much forced to go and photograph at nighttime. And I found that I developed a real love for it for a couple of reasons. My commercial work, I'm being dictated to by a client on how many images they need to get done by a certain deadline, how they want them shot. So long exposure really forced me to slow down. So shooting at night, I could sit there and basically, when I open that camera lens, and some of my exposures are up to half an hour long, everything disappears from my head and I'm there in the moment and I'm totally focused on what I'm doing, but my head is totally cleared. So I do that now, and I do that wherever I go. This image that's on the screen now is actually in Barcelona. While my wife was tucked cozy in bed, I was up at about 5:30 in the morning, roaming the streets looking for things to photograph. This is in Bilbao in Spain as well. Again, early in the morning. My wife thinks I'm nuts. I bring a suitcase of camera gear that's bigger than my suitcase of clothing, and it basically sits in the hotel room for most of the journey, because obviously I don't carry it around with me all day long. It's only when I get up early in the morning to shoot. What I do shoot with is some smaller Fujifilm cameras that I carry around with me. And this shot is an example of the sort of work that I would do with that. Just snapshots. The shots that you saw in the opening slides were some holiday snaps that were taken with the Fuji X cameras that I use. So that basically gives you a little bit of insight into the sort of work that I do. To sum up, my best practices in photography in an hour is actually very, very difficult. So I'm going to go through it step by step. This presentation is being saved as a PDF file. So I will be sending that to Grace, who I believe will be emailing it out to all of you. So make sure that you look out for that if you need to refresh yourself on anything that I cover. Take notes otherwise, and I'll try and answer your questions at the end. But I've put together my 10 best practice tips to improve your photography. Now, I'm not sure I suppose the level of or experience level of those of you watching. So I've kept it fairly basic, and we hope to do some more webinars moving forward where I can get into certain subject matter a little bit more in depth. So my first tip is get it right in camera. I don't care what anyone tells you, you cannot fix a bad photograph in Photoshop. A bad photograph will always be a bad photograph. It's just being improved in Photoshop. So getting it right in camera is my number one tip above anything. So don't rely on Photoshop to fix poor camera craft. Shoot in RAW. Most cameras have a RAW function. Certainly all the digital SLRs and the new crop of mirrorlesses do. Some of the smaller point and shoots do. Shooting in RAW is basically like shooting a negative, where you can actually make prints from, and you can improve the image from there. So essentially every camera, even your iPhone or your smartphone, captures in a RAW format. What happens is if your camera is saving your files as a JPEG, it's actually capturing in a RAW format and then throwing away most of the information and saving a little bit that it's giving you as a JPEG. If you're shooting in RAW, you're actually getting all of that information, and then you can take it into something like Lightroom or Capture One, which is a RAW converter, and determine how to best process or develop that file. In the days of film, this happened. You know, there was not many people that were photographing perfect negatives. The labs would actually adjust the timing of the print and so forth to get the best result for you. So shooting in RAW will really improve your photography in the long term. It will take a little bit of getting used to. If you haven't worked in RAW before, I suggest you shoot in RAW and JPEG simultaneously, so there's no nasty surprises. But moving forward, if you really start looking at a RAW workflow, that will really improve your photography, possibly more than anything else will, any one major thing. The next thing I suggest you do is learn to understand what that histogram is telling you. So learn to read the histogram. When you're taking a photograph, a lot of people do what's called chimping, where they grab the camera and they look in the back of the camera to see the image. The problem with that is what we're seeing is affected by our environment. So if we're out on a really, really sunny day, our images will look underexposed. If we're in a dark room, they'll look brighter than what they probably are. Whereas the histogram is giving us a real-time understanding of how bright or how dark that image is. And we're going to go into a little bit more detail in that in the next couple of slides. Shoot to the right is a term that is used by photographers, and that's in relation to the histogram, and that's where we position the information within the histogram. So I'll explain that to you shortly as well. The other thing is try and try again. Even as a professional, you know, we quite often don't quite get it right or get it the way that we want, that we would like. Particularly with my personal work, I might go out and have an idea in mind and I don't quite pull it off because the weather's not right, the clouds aren't right, for whatever reason. Don't be afraid to try it again and keep trying until you get it right. That's how you learn, you know. No one started out getting a perfect shot first go, and you know, not many people still do. Most photographers will still look at their work and think, geez, I wish I had done that a little differently or whatever. So don't be afraid to try and try again. Look at your images, look at where you feel they've gone wrong, work out how you need to get around that and go back and try it again. All of this is being done in the camera before we even take the card out of the computer. Oh, sorry, the card out of the camera and put it into the computer. So really important point. My best practice tip number one. Second one is see the light. Learn to observe the light. Without light, we have nothing. Light is what photography is all about. The position of the light gives a shape and form. The hardness of the light or the softness of the light can totally change the way an image appears. So learn to look at the light and understand the light, because that's going to make a real difference. So if you're driving, you know, on a sunny afternoon and the sun's going down and you think to yourself, geez, the lighting's beautiful now, have a look at it and try and think why the lighting is looking as good as it is. Okay. So another thing is, when on location, be patient. We see these wonderful landscape photographs by professional landscape photographers, and I see amateurs go out in the middle of the day and try and take the same shot. The difference between someone who is experienced in that field, and not only landscape, it's commercial, it's in architecture, it's in fashion, it's in everything. It's about knowing when's the best time of the day to shoot. Okay, so a professional landscape photographer, if you go to their gallery, they're generally up at dawn or before dawn, getting ready and photographing as the sun's coming up, or later in the day as the sun's coming down, when the sun is low, giving us long shadows, giving us lots of depth and shape to our images. That's really, really important. Going out in the middle of the day, the light is very, very hard. The shadows are very hard and very, very small. So we lose a lot of effect. So be patient and plan ahead. If you're looking for a particular effect, then you should really sort of be working out what time of the day is going to be best suited to that effect. There's lots of apps that you can get on your phone that will tell you where the sun will be at a certain time of the day at a given location. So you can really plan ahead and work out whether a morning shoot would be better for that or an afternoon shoot would be better for that, if that's the effect that you're looking for. If we're using a flash, everyone slides a flash on the camera. A flash on top of the camera is really, really harsh. It's straight into the face and it flattens everything out. You can get leads for your camera. Some cameras now come with I'll go back again. You can get leads for your flash that will connect it to the camera. So you can physically take it off and hold it off camera to reposition the light to give you a different result. Some cameras actually have triggers now, or some flashes rather have triggers that will work remotely so that you can actually take it off and get someone else to hold the flash. Taking the flash off the camera and moving it around the scene will improve your photography. It's not going to be an instant improvement. You have to observe and look at what the light's doing, but it's going to give you a better way of photographing and give you more control over the lighting rather than just in your face all the time. Okay, so same deal in the studio. If you're shooting in the studio with lighting, you can see that all my lights behind me here. There's lots of different light shapers and modifiers, and on the wall over here behind me, I have lots of little modifiers, and over on my lights, I have big modifiers. And the reason that we have all of those is because they all give us a different effect. So, you know, if you do have lights, even if it's just portable flashes and using modifiers, experiment with them and have a look at what they're doing and see how it's changing the scene and get used to what it's doing so that you can repeat that if you need that effect in a shot moving down the track. And for white balance, which we haven't really touched on, or for you know, getting the right color balance in your file, there's a thing called an X-Rite Color Checker Passport, but there's lots of gray balance or white balance reference devices that you can get. But when you're shooting in RAW, you can actually photograph in a scene and then take out again. And it's a very, very simple way of white balancing your files at a later stage, because bad color quite often is can be brought down to a bad white balance. So we try and correct the color, whereas the overall white balance is wrong. And if we got that right, the color in the image would be much, much better. So that is my best practice number 2. Now I'm just trying to change this. The next one is composition. So composition is really, really important. I've just been judging some photography awards for the last few days, and you can see very, very clearly some people that have a grip on composition and some people that have no idea. It doesn't come naturally. It takes practice, but you can't practice these rules if you don't know what they are. So it's really, really important that you understand what the rules of composition are. So the first thing I'm going to say to anyone that isn't a regular photographer is don't always photograph what's in the center of the frame. I see it happen a lot where people just photograph what's in the center of the frame because that's where the focus points are. Explore what's in the frame, where to position things within the frame. To do that, we can start taking into consideration some rules of composition. And I'm going to give you a list of them that you can look up on Google at any point and familiarize yourself with, but they do make a lot of sense. So learn the basic rules of composition, but don't be tied to them, okay? Because rules are made to be broken. So you can change things, but if it's working, great. If it's not, refer back to your rules of composition. It might just tidy up an image that you're having trouble with. So some of the basic rules are the following: the rule of thirds, the Fibonacci spiral, which I've got on display here, the golden ratio, leading lines, negative space, color, and contrast. But remember, rules are made to be broken. So if it's working without you following any of those, go for it. Because there's some great images that don't follow those principles, but they're a really, really good start to getting your eye in and training yourself to see things differently. Go to the next slide. So my best practice number 4 is workflow, is having a good workflow. And I teach at Swinburne University here in Melbourne, and I see a lot of students that sort of use a raw workflow, but don't exploit that workflow to get the best out of their images, or out of their files rather. So my suggestion is this: when you're shooting in RAW, you will bring it into a RAW converter, which is a rendering engine, because at the RAW stage, we haven't yet converted that file into pixels. So the fundamental difference between a RAW converter and something like Photoshop is one is rendering pixels out of the RAW file. The other one is modifying the pixels. So programs like Capture One, which is my preferred RAW processing software, or Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw, they take the data that your camera's captured and convert them into pixels. That is the point where you need to be doing most of your adjustments. So things like exposure, curves, levels, pretty much anything that you can do in the raw workflow should be done at that point in the process. Once you've got the file looking the way you want, you've got the image looking the way you want in that raw software, only then should you process it out into Photoshop. A raw file is like a negative. You can't change it. All you can do is make suggested changes on how you're going to process it and process it out into something else. So there is no actual change happening to the raw file. That remains intact, like a digital negative, if you like. When we're importing into Photoshop or into Affinity Photo, which is another program out there that a lot of people are starting to use, you should always import in 16-bit. And we're going to talk about bit depth in a moment, but 16-bit, if you just think of it this way, the more bits in your file, the more data, and data equals tone. So it'll give you more tonality to work with. So perform edits not possible in your raw converter in Photoshop, and then do all your finishing touches, your sharpening and so forth, or in your preferred pixel editor. There is more than just Photoshop and an Affinity Photo, but they're the most common ones. So, best practice number 5 is to work in 16-bit. Now, essentially, working in the highest bit depth means we're working with the most amount of information that we possibly can. A higher bit depth means more data, which means more tonality. I don't know if you've seen photographs that are where maybe it's a landscape in the sky, rather than being a nice smooth tone from a light blue to a deep blue, is sort of lines where there seems to be gaps in the tonality. That generally happens when you're working on a file and you don't work in a high enough bit depth. And we'll explain that a little bit more in a moment. But in Photoshop, if you're working in a JPEG or a TIFF in 8-bit, it has 256 levels of tone in each channel, that is, so in red, green and blue. Each time we increase that by 1 bit, we're actually doubling the amount of tone. And I've just done a quick little slide here to show you. So a JPEG is 8-bit. It has 256 levels of data. So think of those levels as tone. If you have a look down the bottom at 16-bit, we've got 67,072 levels of tone. Now that's fantastic, but unfortunately most cameras don't capture in 16-bit. If you have a lot of money and you buy an expensive medium format camera, it will. Generally speaking, with your digital SLRs and mirrorless cameras, they're capturing at about 14-bit. But even so, at 14-bit, we've got 16,768 levels of data, or tone, if you like, in each of the channels. Okay, so we've got a lot more than 256. So those subtle little changes in a sky or in a very subtle gradient will remain a subtle gradient as opposed to developing hard lines. Now, if you have a perfect image in 8-bit, it will render that beautifully. It's when we start doing work to it that we have the problem. And we'll get onto that in a moment. So the histogram, we really need to understand the histogram. The histogram is a great tool that gives us a great visual indication of what it is we're looking at in the file. Now, doing a bit of research, I've seen plenty of websites that show you pictures of the perfect histogram. Well, I'm going to bust that myth. There is no such thing as a perfect histogram, because a histogram is entirely dependent on the image that it's representing. So if I have an image of a white wall, I'm basically going to have a histogram with one white line if it's a pure white. So a perfect histogram wouldn't look like the one on my screen at the moment. Same if I have a black wall or a very, very dark wall, there's going to be a whole lot of information down the bottom. And that histogram's telling me that that tone is like that based upon the way the data is distributed throughout the histogram. So, as I said, there's no such thing as a perfect histogram, and it's entirely dependent on the image. So the histogram's a visual guide of how the tone is distributed, and I've done another slide here to try and break that down a little bit further. I know it's geeky and it's complex stuff, but it's really, really quite simple to understand, and I'm going to give you some examples in a minute so that you know. But if you cast your mind back to a couple of slides ago when I was talking about bit depth, just to give you an idea of how quickly we can ruin a file if we're only working in 8-bit. And this is why I encourage you to work in RAW and in the RAW format in the highest bit or data that you can. Now, Photoshop refers to everything above 8-bit as 16-bit. So if you've got a digital SLR and it's only capturing in 12 or 14-bit, Photoshop will still tell you that it's 16-bit. But don't worry about that. The important thing is that you're working in 16-bit. Another myth I'd like to bust, you can't put in an 8-bit file and convert it to 16-bit because you're not actually putting anything more into the file. The data's been lost. That must take place at the raw conversion part of the process. So from your raw converter, you bring it into your pixel editor like Photoshop as 16-bit. If you haven't done that and it's 8-bit, if you have a look at the histogram in front of me, or in front of you rather, what happens is very, very quick degradation. So I'll explain to you very, very quickly how we read a histogram. So on the left of the histogram, that represents the dark parts of the frame, and that's where the 0 is. Okay, so 0 is the dark parts of the frame. Then we go right through to 255, which is the bright parts of the frame. So 0 to 255 is actually 256 if we count the 0. A mid-tone grey is exactly halfway, and that's represented by 128. So half of 256 is 128. So that's grey. So we've got black at 0, grey at white, and then we're, I'll start again. We've got black at 0, grey at 128, and white at 255. That's the limits of our histogram. In our RAW file, there's information that exceeds past that. But in our 8-bit file on the screen and in our TIFF file on the screen, that's the end of it, okay? What is held within those 256 levels. So what falls outside the histogram is gone. I want you just to notice a couple of things. Firstly, how dark or light areas of your frame are represented by where they appear on the scale. How much of that darkness or lightness is represented by how high the histogram goes. So looking at this histogram in front of me, I can see that we have a fair amount of pixels that are in the darker range. We have a huge amount of pixels in our file that are in the mid-range because of the big lump in the middle, and then it tapers down, and then we have a little peak where we've got some highlights at the white end of the frame. The height of that histogram, all that's doing is illustrating how much tone we have in that area, okay? So left to right is black to white. The height is just how much black or white at that given point. So it's a little bit like an abacus. We had an abacus with 256 spikes on it, and we said, okay, there's one pixel in our frame that's a grey one. I'll drop it on the grey spike. There's a white one. By the time we've been through the whole image, it would give us a histogram essentially of what we're viewing. Unfortunately, the data in that histogram is not evenly distributed. Even though the histogram in Photoshop and on your camera is equally divided, it's not actually equally distributing the data. And this is where shooting to the right comes into play. And we'll get onto that a little bit further. But there is the least amount of information is in our shadows. And if you look on the screen, the first stop, which is the halfway mark of our histogram underneath, that first stop in the highlights is taking up 128 levels of our tone. And every time we go down the histogram by one stop, we're halving that amount again. So as we go down, okay, I could only fit about 7 stops in here and then the writing would get too small, but cameras have much more than that in their dynamic range now. But just in this instance, if we're assuming my shot is 7 stops, the first stop is 128 levels of tone. The second stop is 64. The third is 32. By the time I get down to the 7th stop, which is in my shadows, there's only 2 levels of tone or 2 levels of data. So if we underexposed an image by just 1 stop as an 8-bit file in a JPEG, and we went to our levels to bring our white point in to stretch that out, we've actually instantly lost half of our tonal range. If we're working in 16-bit, however, or 14-bit, we've got way, way more information in there than those 256 levels. So when it resamples, it fills itself in with actual data that exists rather than chopping it out. So as I said, it's probably a bit geeky, but important to know. So the shadows contain the least amount of information and the highlights account for the most, which is why we use the theory of shooting to the right. So now that we know that the shadows are on the left-hand side of the histogram and the highlights are on the right, we can actually use that to our advantage by shooting to the right. So rather than looking at a picture on your LCD screen and saying it's too light or dark, when your vision's being affected by the environment that you're in, You can now look at your histogram, because you should understand by now a little bit that information to the right of the histogram means the frame is very bright. Information to the left of the histogram means the information in the frame is very dark. Now, it may be dark if you're shooting in a dark environment and you want it to look dark. That's fine. But knowing that that's what the file's doing is the important thing. So here's a shot that I took out at Clifton Springs, an outer suburb of Geelong, or it's out on the Bellarine Peninsula. And it was a 15-minute exposure or 14-minute exposure. And here's the histogram. So you can look at that file and you can see that there's a lot of stuff in the upper end of the histogram in terms of brightness. So all of the data in the histogram is up that end of the frame. Shooting to the right, as we know, is going to give us the most tonality, because that first stop has half of the whole file's tonality in it. The second stop down has half of that again. So we know if we shift all of our information up that histogram, then we're going to be getting the most tone in our file. So shooting to the right simply means exposing so that all the data is to the right-hand side of the histogram without clipping. And what clipping means is without going off the edge of the histogram. We don't want that mountain of information going and stopping, because then we've clipped our highlights. Clipping our highlight means that we've blown it out to 255 so that there's absolutely no detail in there. All right. So we want to make sure that we're getting our exposure right up to that end without chopping it off. That's what shooting to the right is. Now, using shooting to the right can be really, really helpful. So you need to ignore the visual on your LCD screen, even if it looks overexposed. Because remember, your eye's being influenced by everything around you and the image may look overexposed. What you need to look out for is to make sure that that histogram isn't being clipped on the end, because that's when it is overexposed. But if you get all of that information and push it up the histogram to the point just before clipping, then you're getting the most tonality in that file that you can get. Now, if it's an image that is fairly dark and you're pushing all that information up, provided you're not clipping, what we're doing is we're grabbing all of this tone that's in the dark areas, that when we go to our raw processing, we can move our exposure down and push all that information back down into the shadows. But rather than have 2 levels of tone in the 7th stop, we might have pushed it down and we're pushing maybe 6, 8, 10 levels of tone into those shadows, so that we have a much, much richer shadow with a lot more detail in it. So what we're essentially doing is working with the part of the file that contains the most tonality or the most data, the most information, irrespective of how the image looks on the back of the camera. When we get back in post, we then have the ability to distribute that tone where we would like it to be and put the most tone in the areas where they should be. Like I said, it's a bit geeky and it's probably over a lot of people's heads, but in an hour we can't go into it much more than that. But just to give you an idea, I've put some examples up. The shot that I took here in Barcelona, this is a scene where you look at it, the black's in the frame, there's only a little bit of black in the concrete wall there, and there's some darker tones in the lighthouse, and they are represented by these little mounds to the left-hand side of the histogram. Most of the sky is a mid to a lighter tone than mid, which is the sky, which is where we see the big lump, all right? And then it comes down as the tones get brighter. I can see very, very quickly that the data in this histogram is mainly to the right because this is a fairly bright frame. If I go to the next shot, which was shot at night, you can actually see that this is clipping a little bit. And clipping, if you look at the histogram down on the dark-hand side, the left-hand side, the dark edge of the histogram, that clipping would represent the very extremes of the frame here. It's a shot of the Melbourne Museum where it has actually gone to black. Now, this image was taken at night, and there's a spotlight lighting the roof of the parapet of the Melbourne Museum here in Melbourne, and there's light bleeding through onto the clouds above it. But where that spotlight fades out, there's no light, it's going black. There's nothing there for me to photograph. So that vignette, if you like, hasn't actually been introduced in post-production. That's how it was photographed. So there is very, very little detail around the edge of the frame. Those black edges are represented where it is running off the frame. But you can see that the majority of this image is in the darker tones in the histogram. So all of that lump of information that we see in the histogram is down the darker end. Now, I hope you understand that. So I'll just very, very quickly summarize that for you. Essentially, if the image is dark, that mount is going to be down the lower end of the histogram. If the image is bright, it will move up. One thing I haven't said is that information in the histogram is there after I've processed the file. The histogram of the file that I actually captured with the camera may have been completely different. It may have been that well, it would have been completely different. I won't say may have, it definitely would have been. I would have been shooting to the right, pushing all that information up and then pushing it down so that I have nice, crisp blacks, crisp shadows where I'm retaining lots and lots of detail. Detail is tonality. It's the tonality that's giving us detail. The more tonality we have in those areas, the more detail we have. So this is why we work this way and we shoot to the right. Okay, long exposure photography. I'm talking about that because that's something that I do a lot of. So I'm just going to give you some very, very general, easy tips after that heavy going with the histograms and shooting to the right. I realize that it is heavy going, but it is really, really important stuff. So I felt that I should talk about that. So when I'm doing my long exposure photography, I actually consider the previous 6 steps that we took: getting it right in camera, making sure I'm framed correctly, composed correctly. I take some test shots, make sure that I'm shooting to the right, that my histogram is right, and then I shoot. So I've already done all of this before I even take my final shot. There are a couple of little practical tips that you need to be aware of when shooting long exposure photography. So long exposure photography is keeping the camera open. And long exposure photography could be 30 seconds. It could be an hour. There's a photographer in the US, a British photographer called Michael Kenner. He leaves his camera open sometimes for 2 hours. I've seen some work recently of a local guy here in Melbourne who leaves his camera open for months. Now, that's really, really extreme. But if your camera's moving during that exposure, anything that is still like a building or a landscape that shouldn't move is going to be blurry. So it's of paramount importance that the first thing we do in long exposure is we use a solid tripod and we reduce any ability or anything that can give movement to the camera. And the most common thing that I see people going wrong with when they're doing long exposure photography is winding their center column up. Their center column is weakening the tripod, and it has flex in it. So on a long exposure, if it's windy, you might be getting your camera doing this, and you'll be very, very disappointed with the results when you get home because the camera's moved and everything's blurry. So the first thing, use a solid tripod with the center column all the way down. If you don't have a solid tripod, a lot of tripods have a hook on the bottom. You can hang your camera bag on there to give it extra weight, to really hold it down tight, to stop it from vibrating. I've shot in gale force winds and kept my camera perfectly still using that technique. Incidentally, I've cut my center column down to about that tall for my long exposure so that I can't even lift it up if I want to. On a DSLR camera, you need to cover the rear viewfinder. So the longer you're exposing, the more you're going to need to do this. I had a Canon Pro Digital SLR that had a little lever that I could flick in the viewfinder that had basically like a shutter or a blind that would block any light coming in through the viewfinder. Canon 5D comes with a little rubber cup that goes over the viewfinder to block light coming in. But you can use a hat, a beanie, a bit of gaffer tape, anything. Because during a long exposure, light is actually going to get into the back of your camera through the viewfinder. That is only, however, on a camera that has a mirror. So if you're using a mirrorless camera, you don't have to worry about it because the viewfinder is totally sealed and it's an LCD display. But if you're using a camera that has a mirror, a digital SLR in it, you really need to cover up that rear viewfinder. Or what you'll find is that you will end up with a shot that has fog in it. And a very, very funny story, a very well-known camera and lighting importer in Australia, is a good friend of mine that I go away shooting with. We were down in Tasmania photographing, and we were all shooting with our cameras, and it was pitch dark, and we've all covered ours up, and he's running around with a headlight on, and we're going, turn your light off, you're ruining our shot. Anyway, he didn't cover the back of his viewfinder, and when he got all his images back, because he's looking in the back of his camera, he's shining this really bright headlight right into his viewfinder, so all of his images were ruined by this light coming in through the back of the camera. So it's very real. So yeah, carry a beanie, a bit of gaffer tape or something to cover the back of your viewfinder. If you're using exposures longer than what your camera can actually take, sorry, I'll rephrase that. If you're using an exposure that's longer than the maximum length exposure your camera will let you dial in, you're going to need to be able to keep the camera open. So you'll need a remote cable or a cable release. And when I say lockable, I mean one that you can actually push it to close the shutter and lock it so it keeps the shutter open. So if I'm working with the digital SLR or a camera like that and I'm doing a really long exposure, I use the cable release in the bulb mode or B setting, and I lock it off. And then I use the timer in my iPhone, and I go and have a coffee or something while I'm waiting for the scene to expose. Some of the newer cameras will actually let you set the timer now up to an hour. So people are getting, or the camera manufacturers are getting wind of the fact that people want to do exposures longer than 30 seconds. So a lot of cameras now are building that in. But if you're using a cable release, make sure it's one that's lockable. If it's a shorter exposure that you can dial in, you can use your self timer. You want to avoid bumping the camera, so keeping the camera as still as possible. Secure straps or remove them. So biggest fault that I see a lot of people do when they're doing long exposure photography and it's a windy day is they have their big camera strap hanging down, flapping in the wind. That flapping in the wind is vibrating the camera, which is effectively softening the image. So either take your camera strap off altogether, or grab a piece of Velcro or a big Posties rubber band or something and strap it to the tripod so that it can't flap around. Okay, because that flapping in the wind is going to give a fine vibration through your tripod, and it's going to give you a soft image. And there's nothing worse than something that looks really, really good that's not quite sharp. So the best tip that I can give you in terms of keeping your files clean is to shoot, if you're doing a long exposure, in the camera's native ISO. What the native ISO is basically is the lowest ISO that your camera shoots in. Generally it's 50 or 100 ISO, but it's the lowest ISO that you can go to without having to engage a special custom function. Okay, so if your camera, the lowest one you turn it down is 100 ISO, that is the best ISO to be shooting a long exposure. And remember, it's long exposure. We don't need to be arcing up the ISO to make the camera more sensitive, because to do that, then we're probably going to have to put more neutral density on to compensate. Leave it on the lowest ISO. You're better off shooting for 8 minutes at 100 ISO than cranking it up and shooting for 2 minutes, because what you'll get in the end of it is the one at 100 ISO will be clean and almost noise-free. The one that's shot at 800 ISO will be very grainy and noisy and look terrible. So base ISO. There is one point that I've just thought of that I didn't put in there, is that, and now I've forgotten, it's gone again. I'll think of it in a minute. Hang on a sec. So slow down, take your time. Really, really important that you take your time to think about what you're doing, because your long exposure photography, I've just remembered what I was going to say. Always make sure you have noise reduction switched on in the camera. Long exposure, noise reduction needs to be switched on. If that's not switched on in the camera, you'll get lots of hot pixels that appear like white dots and lots of noise in the file. When we do a really long exposure, what the camera does is it exposes and then it closes. And then it does a black calibration where it actually takes another photograph with the shutter closed, if you like, to measure which pixels are failing at that length of time. And then through software internally in the camera, it cleans up all the noise. If you're shooting long exposure and you don't have long exposure noise reduction switched on, and it's most cameras have this setting, you'll find that you'll be disappointed with the results because it'll be very, very noisy. base ISO, noise reduction switched on, you're going to end up with really super clean files. Lock your tripod down, they're going to be pin sharp and you're going to be really, really pleased. Another tip, use your LCD display to focus. Okay, because you're photographing something static that you want sharp, and it's all the moving stuff in the frame that you want to blur out. Zoom into 100% on your LCD screen and use that to focus, because that's going to give you a much sharper image than looking through the viewfinder at something that's really small or using your autofocus. So yeah, slow down and take your time, because if you're going to do an 8-minute exposure, you're going to be sitting there for 16 minutes. 8 minutes for the actual exposure, another 8 minutes for the black calibration or the noise removal exposure, if you like. Another thing I've got to say is something that I used to do that I've since discovered is a real no-no. Noise reduction only works if the camera is in the same environment. So if you're photographing in the snow and you've done a 10-minute exposure and you think it's very cold out here, I'm going to take the camera into the car and let it do its black calibration in the car, where I've got the heater on, the environment's completely different, so the noise reduction isn't going to work. If you photographed it in gale force winds in the snow, that's where you need to do your black calibration as well. So very interestingly, there's some new technologies with some of the medium format cameras now where we don't need ND filters. It takes multiple short exposures and blends them into one raw file. So because the exposure is very, very short, the black calibration frame is also very, very short. So you can get out of the cold quicker. Anyway, the last tip with long exposure photography, generally people do it at dusk or in the morning. Now, if you're doing it at dusk, the sun's actually going down. Now, if you're doing a long exposure, you need to calculate that it's actually getting darker every minute you're exposing. So you need to compensate for that. Thinking about keeping all of our information to the right of the histogram, we need to preempt that the sun's going down. So double your exposure. If you were going to do an 8-minute exposure and the sun's going down, make it a 16-minute exposure or open up a stop. Don't increase your ISO. Likewise, if it's sunrise, do the same, but in reverse. Slow your shutter speed down a little bit, or the length of your exposure down a little bit to compensate for the light getting brighter as the day begins. I feel like asking if there's any questions, but I can't hear anyone, so I don't know. So I can't. I've got, just bear with me. I've got a little window covering half of my screen, so I can't actually see what it's saying. Just bear with me for a tick. I'm just going to get out of here and move this and then get back in there again. I'll just get down through there. Yeah, experiment with exposure times too. And what I mean by that is experiment with exposure times, not to experiment with making your frame lighter or darker. Hopefully we will have worked that out already, okay? Experiment with exposure times because the longer the exposure is, the more effect it's having on motion. So for argument's sake, if you're photographing a rippling sea, 30 seconds isn't enough. It's great for a waterfall because the water's moving very, very quickly, but a sea is moving a lot slower. And if you want a mirrored ocean, you're going to have to do a much, much longer exposure. I don't have any success photographing Port Phillip Bay here in Melbourne for anything less than 4 minutes. So it's 4 minutes or higher. All right, there was a lot of people asked about ND filters in the feedback that we had. So ND filters come in two shapes, and in two types. And I quite often get asked what I think is the best. People think, oh, I'll get a variable ND filter because it's very, very easy. It's one filter. I can just dial in what I need and that'll work great. And technically speaking, it will, to a point. And I suppose the idea is to know at what point that works. So first thing with an ND filter, it's very, very easy to use. If you're looking through your camera and you're looking at the light meter, you can just dial it down and see your exposure come down until you get it to the point where you think that's the exposure I want. And that's great. Okay, you just dial it in. It's great for video. Okay, if anyone's shooting video with their camera, because you can just dial it in to control your shutter speed. It's great for small to medium ND effects. If you want to bring it down to 30 seconds or something like that, one of these filters will do the job for you. It's not great for really long exposures. It's not particularly great when you need to have an exposure that's in minutes and the light's that low that your meter in your camera stops responding. So you're going to have to start doing some calculations. So it's not difficult. What we do is we make a calculation without the ND filter, and then we add in the filter factor. And I'm going to give you a little chart that makes it really easy for you if you want to go down that path to work out your exposures. But it's not great for really, really long exposures. And when I'm shooting at night with an ND filter on, my light meters don't work. My handheld light meter doesn't work because there's not enough light. So I've got to try and work it out a different way. So it's really difficult to calculate exposures, because when we're trying to calculate exposures, we're trying to calculate that exposure based on the number of stops of neutral density we've applied. And when you're rotating a filter, it's very, very hard to know how many stops you've actually blocked of light you've blocked out of the camera. So it's difficult to calculate your exposure. The other thing that you will get is that a variable ND is not a true ND in the sense of the word. It's essentially two polarizing filters that when they're rotated together block the light out. And if you go too far, this is what you get, this cross effect that you get on the screen. And if anyone's done that and thought they've had a faulty filter, no, it's not a faulty filter. It's just that you've pushed it too far. So generally, if you get a variable ND that they say will give you up to 10 stops, don't use it over 8 stops, because you're going to start seeing this X effect appear, which is really disappointing if you've got a nice image and all of a sudden it ends up like this. So variable NDs are great, but only for small amounts of neutral density. Neutral density basically is like a pair of sunglasses for your camera. All it's doing is blocking the light. The variables are using cross-polarizing of two filters. A real fixed ND filter is actually a piece of glass that's been darkened to give us a certain amount of reduction in light. So I have both, but I'll be honest, I don't use my variable ND very much. If I only need a little bit and my light meter's working, and I'll chuck it on. But generally speaking, I would use a fixed ND filter with set amounts of neutral density. And I use the square filters that you see here, Firecrest, that are by Format High Tech. They're my preferred filters. And I use a filter system where I can just drop them in so I can change them. So it's very good. So they are available in circular screw-in type filters, and they're also available in square filter systems in sizes up to 165 millimeters in glass or optical resin. The reason they're so big is so that you can put them over your widest angle lens without getting any vignetting. So that's really handy, but it means we've got a filter this big. Optical resin is good if you're traveling. It's very, very clear like glass, but it's lightweight and it won't break in your suitcase. So they're good. They're available in strength of up to 16 stops. So if you think about the variable ND, if I'm sort of telling you that you shouldn't go over 8, we can get one filter that will give us double that here. The beauty is I could stack them. I could stack two 16-stop filters and have 32 stops of reduction if I wanted to. Not that I would ever do that. It's probably going way too far, but you could do that if you wanted to. So great for really long exposures when your light meter's no longer responding. Okay, so what I mean by that is it might be responding without the ND filter, but then when you put the ND filter in, it no longer responds. So you've got to work out that filter factor manually. Because it's a fixed amount, there's no guesswork. We know we've blocked the light by 16 stops. I can do my calculation on that. And most of all, it doesn't suffer from the X effect. Doesn't matter how much you put on top of each other, you'll never get that X effect that you get with variable NDs. So I've included a little chart that I made for a long exposure workshop I did a couple of years ago that should be self-explanatory, but it's very, very easy to work out. If you have a look at the top line where it says shutter speed without filter. Okay, if you go to the right of that and you look at the shutter speed, if your camera is set on one of those shutter speeds, you just drop down, and for each stop that you drop down, it will tell you what you need to set your camera up. So for argument's sake, if I was shooting for 1 second, okay, which is the last one, and I put a 13 stop ND filter on, my camera would give me a 2 hour, I would have to expose the camera for 2 hours, or expose the sensor rather for 2 hours. So you can look at this and you can say, okay, I'm in a scene, currently the light is giving me an exposure with the aperture I want to use of 1/30th of a second, but I really want to expose for about 8 minutes. I can go to that 1/30th of a second. I can go down and I can have a look, and I can't get 8 minutes out of 13 stops, but I could probably add another 1 stop to that to get it, but I could get 4 minutes. The next stage is 30 minutes, but if I went to 14 stops of ND, I could get 8 minutes because that's going to increase it by a stop. So I could stack a 13 stop and a 1 stop ND filter together to give me that 14 stops, which would give me the 8 minutes. Or I could stop the lens down to 15 seconds with a 13 stop and it would give me an exposure of 8 minutes. Okay. Right, Ian's best practice number 9 is understand colour management. And there's no way I'm going to be able to explain to you in an hour all the principles about colour management, but I just want to address a couple of areas where I see really, really common issues. So ICC profiles, very, very simply put, are like a translator between devices. So if you think that you're, if you think of it like this, the camera here speaks French, but the BenQ monitor up in the top right speaks Greek, right? But the computer in the middle speaks Latin. The ICC profile is going to convert the French to Latin, okay, coming from the camera, and then from the computer to the monitor is going to convert the Latin to Greek, which the BenQ understands. I know it's not languages, but it's numbers. Everything in digital photography is based on numbers. So numbers make up the color. So we have 256 levels of color in a red, green, and blue channel, and the mixtures of those are what give us color. But every device will give us a slightly different color with the same set of numbers. So we just need to measure that and make tweaks through these profiles. So there are input profiles. So input profiles are the profiles for your device, like your camera and your scanner, that are going into your computer. So they're input profiles. These days, we don't really need to profile our cameras anymore because the manufacturers do a pretty good job of doing that internally and giving us a file where the color is reasonably accurate. Then we have output profiles. Okay, output profiles are the profiles that take the file that we have on our computer and convert them to be perfectly rendered to whatever device we're using. So they might change the color slightly to the monitor, or they'll change the color slightly to the printer so that it's representing the color that we think we're seeing. Right? And in the middle, we have what we call our editing software, or our color space on our machine. And I've got the Photoshop logo here, but that's Lightroom, it's Capture One, it's everything else. That color space in the middle is the amount of color that we're working with. So essentially, we're just converting from one device to another and doing little translations on the side. The most common mistake I see is people choosing their monitor profile as their editing space in Photoshop. And we're going to address that shortly because that is the wrong thing to do. So editing spaces are a space where even amounts of red, green, and blue will give us a neutral gray. All right, that's essentially an editing space. And an editing space is things like sRGB, Adobe RGB, and so forth. So setting your software up so that it's working correctly with the files that you're sending to it's really important. So in Lightroom and Capture One, when you export, you want to make sure you're exporting it in the correct color space. And I'm going to tell you all to use Adobe RGB. So Adobe RGB is much, much bigger than sRGB, or provides a lot more color than sRGB. There are greater profiles or color spaces that render more color, but at the moment, there's no devices that can actually reproduce it. So it's sort of a bit of a waste of time in most cases. There are cases where you would do that, but that's sort of beyond the scope of this presentation. The first thing you need to do is ensure that your software is set up correctly. So when you're exporting, okay, from your raw converter, make sure you're exporting with Adobe RGB set as your color space. Then if you go into your color settings in Photoshop or whatever software you're using, I'm using Photoshop here because it's pretty much industry standard, your working space should be Adobe RGB. So what we're doing is we're processing a file out of our raw conversion software to the colors that are reproducible in Adobe RGB. And in Photoshop, we're going to bring them into that Adobe RGB environment. So set that to Adobe RGB. Incidentally, if you want to find that, just go up to your menu to edit, color settings, and you can change it to Adobe RGB. By default, it will be set to sRGB, which is a color space for the web, okay, which is much, much smaller. So you're not going to get all that beautiful color out of your file that you would get with an Adobe RGB file. And if we ever do a presentation on color management, we'll go into that further. But Adobe RGB to get the best result out of your files. The color management policies that you see there, I keep mine to preserve embedded profiles. The reason I do that is because I do work for other people that may not be using the same color workspaces that I do. You could set that to convert to Adobe RGB if you're only working on your own files, or you could leave that to preserve embedded profiles if you like, because the next step is that I'm going to suggest that you check all of these boxes. What these do is what these boxes do, they don't actually do anything to your file. They just let you know if there's a mismatch. So if you're opening a file that's in sRGB, but Photoshop is set up to work in Adobe RGB, it will say, hang on a minute, this file's sRGB, you're working in Adobe RGB. And then it will present you with an option of what you want to do. And you would convert that to Adobe RGB. It's just a simple reminder. If you're doing some compositing and you've got one file open that's in Adobe RGB, and you open a file that you've taken some years ago to take a component out of it to drop in there when you're working in sRGB, and you don't have these policies switched on, it's not going to tell you. And the color will change when you take that image, take the piece out of the image that's in sRGB and drop it into Adobe RGB. You will actually get a color change and you won't know why. If you have these little boxes ticked, it's going to tell you, hang on, there's a difference in color here. What do you want to do? And you can make the appropriate decision. So that's setting up your color management in Photoshop. So best practice number 9 is some multiple points in color management. The other thing I'd suggest you do is you need to let anyone know who's going to be printing that file or working on that file for you or doing some retouching that you've worked on it in Adobe RGB. Now, Photoshop does this by default, but not all software does. So what I'm suggesting is if you have a look at this, this is the save as screen. So I've had a file open and I've hit save as and done a screen grab. Okay. And if you look down the bottom, the little tick box where it says embed color profile, Adobe RGB, then Adobe RGB will be tagged with that photo. So whoever opens it will know that it's meant to be viewed in Adobe RGB. Because if I don't embed it, it's going to come into someone's workflow and they're not going to know what you've worked on it in. And they may open it in sRGB or ProPhoto RGB or something else, which you didn't intend it to be opened in, and the color will be different to what you actually think it should be. So particularly if you're sending stuff off to printers, if they don't know what profile you've worked in, they don't know what to convert it from into what they're using. So very important that you make sure you always embed your color profile. And I'll put a little circle around it there for you so that you can see exactly what I'm talking about. This way your file will always be viewed as you intended it, okay? So best practice number 10, the start of the whole workflow relies completely on a color managed monitor. Now, I've been brought here today by BenQ. I use BenQ monitors. They're great value for money, so there's going to be an unashamed plug for them here. But I'm going to tell you why and what you need to look for in a color managed monitor. So first of all, we're working in Adobe RGB. So hopefully you understand that that's the amount of color that we have within our file that we're working with. It would be silly to be working on a monitor that doesn't display that amount of color, because then we're making adjustments to colors that we can't see. So we need to have a monitor that can display the color that we're working with. And the BenQ PhotoView, tongue-tied again, sorry. The BenQ PhotoView monitors do that. They do display 99% of the Adobe RGB gamut. They don't display 100%. I don't think there's a monitor on the market that does. 99% is about as close as we can get now. They're factory calibrated. So even before we go down the path of calibrating or profiling our monitor, there's been a factory check done to make sure that they can actually give you a certificate to say that they've checked the color on this and it reproduces the color accurately. So they're calibrated in the factory. They're hardware calibratable. So they have hardware calibration built in. Now, what that means is not that, you know, some of the, there are monitors out there that have what we call a colorimeter or a sensor to read the color in the monitor built into the monitor so that it can calibrate itself. That's not hardware calibration. That's a hardware device built into the monitor, but it's not hardware calibration. Hardware calibration is simply calibrating and profiling the actual video card within, or the lookup tables rather, within the monitor, not within the computer. If we do it within the computer, the signal is being changed as it leaves the computer. If you think back to that chart that I showed you before it gets to the monitor, there's a profile coming out of the computer changing it. If we do it in the monitor, what it's doing, the signal that's coming out of the computer isn't changed. The monitor's tweaking it at the other end. Gives you a much more accurate color profile. Uniformity technology. Uniformity technology really is about knowing that if I've got this picture in this area of my screen, the color is going to be exactly the same than if I had it at that part of the screen. You'd be surprised at how many monitors don't do that. I had an old monitor, I won't mention the brand name, but seriously, one side of the monitor was a completely different color to the other. And it was a really expensive monitor at the time, but that's where the quality was back then. So when you're looking at a PhotoView monitor, a photographer's monitor, specifically made for photographers, that's something that BenQ have addressed to ensure that it is uniform from edge to edge. So the pixels are the same brightness, the same color, corner to corner, edge to edge. Very, very important. The viewing hood that you see in this picture is included, and it's really important to block any light that might be affecting what you see. And the way I sort of explain this to people is that if there's a yellow wall there, it's going to have an influence on what you're seeing, all right? If you're wearing a yellow shirt, that's going to have an influence on what you're seeing, but this hood isn't going to affect that. So don't wear a yellow shirt when you're doing color critical work, because it'll probably have an effect on what you're doing. It has what we call a hotkey puck, and although I don't have a picture of it here, you can see at the bottom there's a round little control dial on the bottom of the monitor that you can very, very quickly change between settings, and it's really, really good. So if you are doing some web work and you want to work in an sRGB workflow as opposed to an Adobe RGB workflow, you can just click on the button and you can actually have it calibrated to sRGB and saved, calibrated to Adobe RGB and saved. There's even a black and white setting. So if you just want to do a quick look at some images to see what they'll look like in black and white, rather than going into your software and changing it, you can just push the button on the monitor and it's going to display the screen as black and white to give you a pretty good idea of how it's going to look. Very, very handy. Also very intuitive to get into the monitor controls and things. Much easier than the little buttons on the monitor with the up and down arrows and so forth. So black and white mode I've talked about. The C models, so some of the models of the monitors have the letter C after them. That essentially means that they support USB-C. That is really, really handy. If you're a photographer that's just primarily using a laptop, and I'm presenting on my MacBook Pro at the moment, which was an expensive laptop, but I would never, ever use it for any color critical work because the screen just isn't good enough. it doesn't provide the full Adobe RGB gamut, and the color is all over the place. It's too contrasty. IMAX are the same. They're not great for color management. They're great to watch movies on, great for, playing games on, but when it comes to actually assessing photography, they're not good enough. So you need a color managed monitor. I run a USB-C version of their 27-inch monitor at home. So if I've been out on a job and I don't want to come back to the studio, I go home, I plug it in with one lead. It's one cable connection. Okay. That one cable connection provides power, sound, data, everything I need. I can actually even leave my laptop closed and just push the power button on the monitor, and it boots up as if it's a desktop computer. So it's really, really handy for those of you that want a solution for doing critical color correction work on your photography or want a bigger screen. You can essentially use it as a one cable docking station. Plug it in and you're ready to go. Lastly, on this slide is the monitors are Kalman verified and Pantone validated. Two huge bodies. I'm not that familiar with Kalman. I had to look it up, but it is a portrait association. But Pantone are basically the industry leaders in color. The printing industry has been using Pantone for years and years and years. It's the benchmark, and they have validated these monitors. So you know you're getting a monitor that's going to be accurate if you go down this path. You're going to need a device. I recommend the i1 display. So this essentially is a light meter for your screen, but instead of measuring light, it's measuring light and color. And it's sending a signal back to the monitor to tell it what it needs to do to make it correct. So there are other brands. This is the X-Rite i1 Display Pro, but there's another brand called Data Color. You're going to need one or the other. If you've already got a Data Color Spider, don't rush out and buy an X-Rite. You don't need to. If you haven't bought one yet, I'd recommend the X-Rite. I just find that the workflow is a little bit better. So profiling your monitor is not a one-off event. If you want to be really serious about the color of your images and you really want to maintain a consistent color and consistent accuracy, it's something you should be doing regularly. With the old CRT monitors, we used to do it weekly. Now I do it monthly. Could probably get away with longer periods, but I want to make sure, and I want to know and be confident that my monitor is displaying color correctly. But should you forget, the monitor will actually tell you that it needs to be recalibrated. You switch it on and it actually, even before it's booted up, the monitor on the screen says monitor needs to be recalibrated. Takes about 10 minutes to do. You need to leave your monitor on for about half an hour beforehand to warm up, but it's not a big deal. I do that, have a coffee, come back, I'm ready to go. So when profiling a BenQ PhotoView monitor, don't use the software that came with this device. If you use the software that came with this device, what we're doing is we're doing software calibration. So if you are running an iMac or you're running another monitor that isn't hardware calibrated, by all means, use the software that came with the device. But if you're running two monitors side by side and you've got one that's a color calibrated, a hardware calibrated monitor, and another one that's not, you would software calibrate the one that's not. You do the hardware calibration on the BenQ. So a lot of people I know have iMacs set up with a BenQ monitor next to it. They use their BenQ for their color critical work, and they use their iMac for their emails and their tools and things. Your BenQ uses hardware calibration, which is what I told you before. Therefore, you need to use the software that came with it. The software that came with it was originally, I'm not sure, I'll have to ask Grace, but was originally developed by X-Rite. So it works really well with the X-Rite device, which is another reason I recommend it. But the basic settings that you need to remember if you're going to calibrate these, because a lot of people buy a colorimeter to calibrate their monitor or profile their monitor, only to discover they don't know how to work it because they don't know what all these numbers mean. So I'm going to go through it and just give you the settings that you should be using for photography. Okay, I'll make it quite clear for photography, because the printing industry, as in offset printing, not photographic printing, will work to a different standard. This is for photography and printing photographs on an inkjet printer. So if you follow these settings, you should be pretty well right. So the first one is we're going to use the BenQ Palette Master Elements software. They're updating it all the time. So even though you do get a disc with the monitor, I suggest you have a look to see what the latest version is online and download that and load that. First thing, we want to set our white point to D65 or 6500 degrees Kelvin. Okay, so that's the white point that we want to set our screen to. Some people also set their screens to native white point. That is permissible too. I'm not actually sure that this software allows us to do that, but I recommend setting to D65. The primaries we don't touch, we leave at Adobe RGB. The luminance is going to depend on our viewing environment, and it's the one thing that we can't really measure. And I'll give you an example of that. If you're lying in bed and the phone goes off in the middle of the night and you pick that phone up, in your dark bedroom, that phone's really, really bright. But if you take that same phone call at midday out on a bright sunny day and you're out on the sunny day, the screen actually looks really, really dark. The screen hasn't changed. The screen is the same brightness that it was. What's changed is the environment in which you're viewing it. So your eyes will adjust accordingly. So it's really important that you understand this. In my studio here, it's quite dark. So I calibrate my studio monitor, 20 candela darker. Candela is the brightness measurement than the ones up in my office where I have big bright windows and lights on, because that's the difference I need to maintain for my eyes to adjust to it. There's some simple ways of doing that. I would suggest that you calibrate your brightness anywhere between 80 and 100 candela, okay? Then we set it to a gamma of 2.2. What the gamma is, it's working out where the midtones of our files need to sit within the file. So they're really the 3 points. Ignore the primaries. The D65 for the white point, the brightness, I've called it luminance just to confuse you, but it's just brightness, somewhere between 80 and 100, and the gamma at 2.2. Now, if you have calibrated and you're doing prints and they're coming out too dark, what that means is for your viewing environment, the monitor is too bright. So you're darkening the file to match your monitor, but because your monitor's too bright, there's actually probably nothing wrong with the file. So if your prints are too dark, it means your monitor's too bright. So go back and revisit the luminance settings and maybe profile it a little bit darker. Same works vice versa. If your prints are coming out too bright, good chances are your monitor's profiled too dark. That's something you have to sort of experiment with. But if you start somewhere between 80 and 100, you really can't go wrong. And last of all, the lineup. These are not street prices. These are recommended retail prices on the BenQ website. I have seen them for cheaper than this out in the real world where you buy them, but they come, they start at about $800 for the cheapest one. All of these give you 99% of the Adobe RGB gamut, and all are hardware calibratable, if that's a word. So any one of them would work well for you. I use the SW321C in my office upstairs, and the 2700 downstairs here, and at home, I have the 270C. All superb monitors. So that basically comes to the end of the presentation. I want to thank BenQ for putting this on. And if you would like to look further at the monitors, there is the web address there. It will be in the PDF when I send it off. And it's now question time. So I'll stop sharing. Have we still got anyone online? Is the big question. Oh, I can't.
Yes, so we still have actually a lot of people online. And we've got 2 questions. So one of the questions was from Grant earlier. He asked, my printing shop recommends sRGB as the preferred format for JPEGs. How does that relate?
Okay, so it depends really on what they're printing on. So a lot of traditional photographic printers aren't able to reproduce the color of Adobe RGB. So what I would suggest anyone doing is, if they are working to the workflow that I discussed, is that they save a file and convert it to sRGB that they send to their lab, but keep their main master file, if you like, in Adobe RGB in the higher bit depth. The minute you go to JPEG, you're also converting it to 8-bit automatically. So the file you send to the lab would be 8-bit sRGB. What you're doing is you're changing the color, or so remapping the color is probably a better way of saying it, to fit into a smaller color space that works with their machinery. So by all means, save it as a JPEG sRGB, but don't keep that as your master file. Just make that file specifically for the lab.
Yep. Okay, perfect. And another question from Alan. He asked, is it better to use 6500K lighting in the room that he edits his photos in?
I use daylight tubes in my room, and I actually think they're 5,000. I think the main thing is that what you're looking at on screen isn't being influenced too much by the light in the room. So keep that light to a minimum. My office upstairs, I actually have floor to ceiling windows around 1 1/4 of the walls. When I'm doing serious color editing work, I actually turn it down. If you can get 65 Kelvin tubes, I think that's great. I've got 5,000K tubes in my office and they work fine. My actual viewing booth ships with 5,000 Kelvin lights and it works fine. The thing is that the color coming out of the white coming out of the screen is D65.
Yeah.
The main thing, sorry, just to touch on that, the main thing is that whatever you're working in, keep it constant. So if the light in that room is changing throughout the day, that will have an effect on what you're seeing. So if you've got a room where you've got morning sun and afternoon shade, you might want to consider closing the curtains when you are doing color critical work to keep that room lighting as constant as possible. It also means you can then work at night and not worry about that light coming in as well.
Okay, thank you. And another question from Tony. When editing a photo in Photoshop on your 4K monitor, what resolution is your monitor set on?
So that's a good question, because when I first bought my 4K monitor, I found that everything was really, really small on the screen. So I wasn't actually working in 4K. So I can't remember what the resolution was, but I went to scale image. I'm on a Mac Pro. I went to scale image and I just went till I felt I was getting headaches reading my emails. The writing was so small. Since I've upgraded to a newer Mac, it's actually fixed that. So it's displaying it still as 4K, but everything on the screen is the right size. At the moment, I'm actually on 4K. That said, my monitor at home is only 2K and that works fine as well. I think the main thing is if you're really having to strain your eyes to look at it in 4K, reduce the resolution, because it can be real. I was getting headaches. I had to up or lower the resolution.
Yep. Thank you. Another question from Marge or Mark. How do you tell if you are clipping with a histogram, and what are the 7 stops you mentioned in the histogram section of your talk?
Okay, so the 7 stops firstly were just hypothetical. Okay, so cameras have what's called dynamic range, and it ranges from 10, 13, 15 stops at the top end of the market, and they are spread out through your histogram. I just used 7 as an example because I got down to 2 levels of tone and I couldn't go any further. It would have been too small on the screen. So don't worry too much about the number of stops. Think more about what I was trying to illustrate, that is, as we go down through the range, every time we go down 1 stop, we're reducing our tone levels by half. That's the thing that I want you to take away from it. The clipping is when you look at the histogram and all of that mound of information is butted right up against it in a straight line, which means that it's been cut off. So it's been clipped, all right? The interesting thing is that if you went back to your raw file, that data probably won't be clipped. You can pull it in. But as a rule of thumb, pushing it to the right as far as you can is the better way to go. So clipping just means cutting off the edge.
Okay, thank you. And I think that's all for the questions, and some people had to leave. So they will be able to email us any questions and I can forward that to you and you can reply there. So what we would like to say is thank you to Ian for the great insights and this wonderful, very informative session. A lot of people have feedbacked to the chat as well as the Q&A, saying that it is very, very insightful and they've learned lots. So we hope
Yeah,
everyone has enjoyed this informative session and was able to learn lots as well. So thank you again for taking your time out to join us. This session was also recorded and will be available tomorrow. I will be sending out the email with all the details where you can rewatch the session, and also Ian will send his PDF file with all the slides from today, and I can upload that, and you can also view or revisit what you missed out as well. So if your questions were not answered, please feel free to contact us from the email that I'll be sending to you guys, and we'll endeavour to provide a response to you as early as possible. And don't forget to fill out the quick survey. Was there anything that you wanted to mention as well, Ian?
I just want to thank everyone for listening. I realise a lot of the subject matter is fairly heavy, and you won't remember everything. I don't expect everyone to remember everything. Some people may already know it all, depending on your experience. But the important thing is that you at least understand that these are things that you need to learn about. So when you download, or if you download the slideshow, you can then actually do your own investigation into those areas one by one until it makes a little bit more sense. And hopefully we might be able to do some more webinars where we go in a little bit more in depth into certain areas to explain it a little bit clearer, if you like. It's a bit hard in an hour. I noticed we've gone over by an hour. So to do it, I was only supposed to talk for an hour, but it's gone a little bit over time. But yeah.
Everybody was willing to stay, so that was
these
good.
are the things to look out for. Yeah. Sorry?
Everybody was willing to stay, so that was okay.
Oh, good. Good.
All right,
Well,
so that's it.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. I
Thank
appreciate you coming on board.
Thank you. We'll see everybody next time.
Thank you.
See ya.
All right.